Welcome in everybody to week 14 Dynasty Lessons Learned. I am going to be switching things up a little bit this week, and I think this is the new format for how I'm going to be doing it moving forward, just because not every game needs to be necessarily talked about, especially as we move towards the remainder of the year. Some of the teams aren't necessarily playing. We have backup quarterbacks and blah, blah, blah. It's not necessarily worth talking about every single thing that happened in every single week moving forward. But I am going to be doing a slightly longer abridged version of this, if that makes sense. Where in the past I've talked about maybe like three-ish kind of players instead of going game by game. This week I have 6 players that I want to talk about as in terms of dynasty lessons learned from this past week of games or this past week of news, so to speak. So I think this is the new format moving forward, and I think you guys will like this one. So let's kick things off with Bucky Irving, man. He has been absolutely fantastic. He has 100% become the Tampa Bay Buccaneers RB1 over the last 3 games that they've played, which is over the past 4 weeks. There's a bye week in there, but from week 10 on, he's been averaging 140 total yards per game, 1 touchdown per game, and is averaging 24.1 PPR fantasy points per game as the RB4 overall over the past 4 weeks. That's RB4 overall in total points over the past 4 weeks with a bye week in there. That's very, very impressive. I think he's RB2 in points per game behind Saquon Barkley over the past 4 weeks because it's Saquon Barkley. But Bucky Irving has been absolutely phenomenal. He is a dynasty RB1, if not honestly more like a top 10 dynasty running back right now. He's the RB11 on keep trade cut. I think you can argue putting him a little bit higher than some of the running backs that he's still behind on this list. Like he's currently behind Josh Jacobs. I feel like that's kind of just a production thing because Jacobs has been really good over the past couple of weeks, but Bucky is still 4 years young, 4.5 years younger than Josh Jacobs. So I think I would put Bucky ahead of him. That makes him a top 10 running back. I would put Bucky ahead of James Cook. I'd put Bucky ahead of Jonathan Taylor. I might consider putting Bucky ahead of Kenneth Walker, but that's really where the line starts to get drawn. So I think Bucky is the RB7 or 8 in Dynasty, still behind a good handful of running backs, but ahead of a lot of other ones, just because he's still 22 years old. He's a rookie. He's already doing this right now in this Buccaneers offense, and he is looking phenomenal. And Rachaad White hasn't necessarily mattered whatsoever over the past few weeks either. I know that there was a comment in a video maybe a week or two ago that Bucky Irving drew comparisons to Kyren Williams pretty recently. I've seen other people say that that was their draft season comp for Bucky was Kyren Williams. And I mean, I went through, if you haven't seen my tweet yet, if you follow me on Twitter and you haven't seen it yet, I made a tweet basically showing all of the comparisons between Bucky and Kyren Williams. It's actually really uncanny how close those two are, and how similarly they both comp from collegiate production in terms of like, yards after contact per attempt. And they both kind of win as receivers, but they were also both bell cows at their school. But they're bell cows despite being slightly smaller ish in frame. They both had poor combine numbers and athleticism numbers. They fell to day 3, I think, because of that combine kind of production. And it just has not mattered in the NFL whatsoever. And Bucky is even doing this in a Sean McVay system. Liam Cohen was the Rams offensive coordinator in 2022 under Sean McVay, and now is bringing that offense over to Tampa Bay. And Bucky Irving is succeeding in the same offense essentially that Kyren Williams is succeeding right now in too. So the comparisons are really, really uncanny. And I think that Bucky Irving is just Kyren Williams 2.0 and deserves to be a top 10, if not even, like I said, a top 8 dynasty running back. So if you can still buy in, I would be buying in to Bucky Irving, especially maybe if you can move off of Kenneth Walker for Bucky Irving plus, Jonathan Taylor for Bucky Irving plus, James Cook for Bucky Irving plus, maybe even Breece Hall for Bucky Irving plus, like something like that, or moving up from some other running backs that maybe are a lot older but still kind of producing. You can move up to Bucky Irving to buy back a little bit of age. I think that would also be a solid trade consideration as well, depending on the package. But he looks like the real deal. He's absolutely phenomenal and is deserving of that top 10, if not top 8 dynasty running back ranking. Next up on the list is a running back that is doing very similar things in Chase Brown for the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been amazing without Zach Moss over the past 5 or 6 weeks or so. But even before then, he was doing really well with Zach Moss too, basically since week 4. Since week 4, he's the RB7 overall. That includes a solid month in there with Zach Moss still playing. He's the RB7 overall, averaging almost 18 PPR points per game. And since week 4, he's on a 17 game pace for 1,500 yards and 15 touchdowns on over 300 touches, which is phenomenal. Chase Brown has absolutely been amazing in this really, really good Bengals offense that is not translating to NFL wins. But for fantasy, that doesn't necessarily matter because the offense is still high powered enough and Chase Brown is getting the job done. I am still concerned, though, a little bit about his longevity. He does turn 25 in 3 months. For those of you that don't know, he was an older prospect coming out of college and will be turning 25 in March in the offseason. So there is that maybe that kind of upsets his offseason value a little bit whenever, people see a 25 next to his name, not like a 23 like they might see with Bucky Irving next year. That might change his value a little bit just because he is older at the running back position, despite him still entering his 3rd year next year. So there is that. What I am more concerned about, and we talked about this a little bit on the trade show that's going to be dropping tomorrow if you're watching this on Wednesday, and I brought it up, that I am a little concerned that Chase Brown is not that he's not the starter next year, but that there's a possibility that maybe he gets a lot of basically he gets good competition or potentially beat out depending on the running back that the Bengals maybe potentially could add. I comped Chase Brown essentially to Rachaad White. I think Chase Brown is way better than Rachaad White and is doing more sustainable things than Rachaad White was doing last year with the Buccaneers. But just bear with me for a second with the comparison. This is a running back that a young running back, and Rachaad White was in his 2nd year last year too, who's very, very productive, maybe overproducing a little bit because he was getting so much volume. And then in the offseason, they really didn't have anybody else. They didn't turn to anybody in free agency. I don't think the Bengals are going to turn to anybody in free agency. But what happened was the Buccaneers were able to draft a running back on early day 3 in the 4th round that was a comparable talent to Rachaad White. And now ultimately what we've seen is he's a better talent than Rachaad White in the NFL and Bucky Irving. And I am worried that the same thing might happen with Chase Brown because this running back class in 2025 is not top heavy, but it is kind of deep in the sense that there are a lot of names right now that could have a wide range of outcomes in terms of their NFL careers, that they've shown in college that they can be really, really good with workhorse volume, or maybe really, really efficient and also somewhat good as kind of more of a committee-ish style guy. Or a bunch of other guys that were just really big, really good bell cows at kind of smaller schools. And maybe they fall a little bit because of that. I think of, like if Cincinnati drafted Devin Neal in the 3rd round next year, I think that's a problem for Chase Brown. If those of you don't know, Devin Neal's the running back out of Kansas. He's really, really good. If they draft that kid out of Iowa, I think that could be a possibility as well. There's a lot of good names that if competition comes in to Cincinnati with Chase Brown, or either it's late on in the 3rd round, early in the 4th round, that I think that Chase Brown will lose production and fantasy production because you won't have the volume that goes along with it. And worst case scenario, I don't think it happens, but worst case scenario is that he does get beat out by this rookie that comes in potentially, just like Rachaad White did with Bucky Irving. So I am hesitant about the rising value of Chase Brown. He's the RB13 on Keep Trade Cut. He's 2 spots behind Bucky Irving, but I feel way more confident in Bucky Irving than I do Chase Brown, not to mention that Bucky is 2 years younger than Chase Brown as well. So I think that this might be a good sell opportunity for Chase Brown, or maybe if you're a contender and you want to use Chase Brown for the remainder of the year, by all means, I'm totally fine with that because he's phenomenal for production right now. But if you're not necessarily a contender, or if we get to the point where you're in the offseason now at the beginning of January, you're reevaluating your team, Chase Brown could be a good trade option for you to either move off to other running backs and get something else on top, upgrade to a running back that maybe you weren't necessarily able to get to, a few months ago, or even a few weeks ago with Chase Brown. Or maybe you can move over to just an entirely different position in general and use Chase Brown as an upgrade piece to upgrade your quarterback in Superflex or your wide receiver just in general. So That I think it's something to think about with Chase Brown, is that there is a possibility that depending on how the offseason goes, and I think it's more likely that they attack the running back position in the draft because they need running backs. They can't just go with just Chase Brown and Khalil Herbert. Herbert's, I think, a free agent anyway. So they're going to have to add somebody. And it's possible that depending on who they add, that talent is a comparable or even perhaps we find out a better talent than Chase Brown, like what happened with Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. So it's just something to take note of. That's my hesitation with Chase Brown right now because his value has risen up so much. If he was still in the, RB 18-ish kind of range, I wouldn't mind it. I probably wouldn't be talking about him as a sell. But the fact that he's the RB 13, if not even potentially the RB 12, because it's just Derrick Henry that's ahead of him, separating between him and Bucky Irving is just 31-year-old Derrick Henry. He's essentially a top 12 dynasty running back, and I think that's a little too high. Moving on, this is essentially a running back show. There is a wide receiver in here, but a lot of these guys are running backs. Breece Hall, I think we got to talk about Breece Hall. Where did it all go wrong? What's happening with him? What do we do with him in Dynasty? He is still somehow the RB 11 overall in fantasy and the RB 13 in fantasy points per game. That's in a PPR format. But he's only scored over 12 and a half fantasy points once in the last 5 games. It was the one that was a couple weeks ago. Big 30-point game that he had. He had like 7 receptions. He scored once or twice. It was a good game, but that was the only game over the last 5 where he scored over 12 and a half fantasy points. And I still can just not put the blame on Breece Hall. I don't think the issue is Breece Hall because we saw he was phenomenal as a rookie. He was phenomenal in year 2 last year. I don't think this is like a Travis Etienne situation where all of a sudden he's just now bad. I think that this is an offensive and Deontay Johnson just got suspended. So there we go. Sorry, notifications on the phone. I think that this is a offensive system and a quarterback issue for Breece Hall. I just think Aaron Rodgers is just really, really selfish. I think that he wants everything to be about him. And I think that the offensive system is not conducive to Breece Hall scoring a lot of fantasy points. And my main argument for that is that Breece Hall right now is 41st in the NFL in red zone carries. 41st. He's behind Alexander Mattison and Zach Moss. And to remind you, Zach Moss has not played since week 8. And he still has more red zone carries than Breece Hall. That is an offensive system and a quarterback issue that they just get down into the red zone. And Aaron Rodgers wants to be the one that throws the touchdown. He doesn't want to hand it off to Breece Hall. He wants to throw the touchdown to Devontae Adams. He wants to throw it to Garrett Wilson. That's what they want to do down in the red zone. And I think that is the main issue for Breece Hall. You look at carries inside the 5, Breece Hall is 27th in the NFL in carries inside the 5. You wonder why he's been bad for fantasy football. He is not scoring touchdowns. You wonder why he's not scoring touchdowns? Because he's not getting volume where it matters the most to score touchdowns. He is too reliant on his raw NFL talent to score touchdowns because he's not getting the volume necessary in and around the goal line. And that is an offensive and quarterback issue. So I think that, and we move into 2025, my hope is that Aaron Rodgers is hopefully retired or he moves on to a different team. I think it'd be funny if he went to the Vikings, but anyway, Brett Favre. Hopefully Aaron Rodgers moves on. They need a new offensive coordinator because they fired Hackett and they turned to a new play caller, or maybe Hackett's still on the team. They turned to a new play caller a few weeks ago, but they need a new offensive coordinator. They need a new head coach. They need new everything. Everything needs to change in New York. And I am hopeful that with a lot of those changes equals a return to Breece Hall being an absolute bell cow in the receiving game, in the run game, in and around the goal line. And that returns him to being a top 5 or even top 3 fantasy running back like he was last year. He's still fine as an RB2 right now, but that's not what you want out of Breece Hall. And I 100% get it, but I would not be panic selling Breece Hall just to get rid of him. I think that there are greener pastures ahead. And the only ways to sell Breece Hall, I think, is to move over to a comparable running back like Devon Achane or Jahmyr Gibbs or Bucky Irving or Kyron Williams or somebody like that. Another top 7 running back I'm fine moving Breece Hall for. But anything other than that, I think is just a panic sell, essentially. And I would not be doing that. All right, wide receiver time now. Jerry Jeudy has been absolutely fantastic since Jameis Winston took over in week 8. Since that time period, he's been, that should say the wide receiver 4 overall, not the RB4, the wide receiver 4 overall, 21.7 fantasy points per game. I believe he's the wide receiver 3 in points per game, wide receiver 4 overall. His floor has been 5 receptions for 70 yards. He has not had fewer than 5 receptions or fewer than 70 yards in a game since Jameis Winston took over. His 17-game pace since week 8 is 112 receptions for 2,100 yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. Obviously, Monday night definitely helped that. He had like 250, but it goes to show you that when you average, or your floor is 70 receiving yards and your ceiling is 250, your 17-game pace is going to be 2,100 yards. So he's been absolutely phenomenal. But my fear is that he comes crashing back down to earth without Jameis Winston in 2025. And I think that they don't turn to Jameis Winston again next year because they're 2-3 with him currently. And while, yes, you can argue that he was the reason that they beat Baltimore in the first week that he started back in week 8, he was also the reason why they lost to Denver on Monday night, or at least was a main reason as to why, because he gave them two defensive touchdowns, almost gave them a third at the end of the game. But they scored 14 of their 41 or 42 points on Monday night was from Jameis Winston. And it's not to say that, they'd be better going to Deshaun Watson or anybody. God, I'm not at all suggesting that whatsoever. Please don't go back to Deshaun Watson. But I think that from an NFL standpoint, I think the Browns might look at other quarterback options than Jameis Winston because, the Buccaneers turned away from Winston. The Saints turned away from Winston. The Browns kind of have held on to him and they haven't, but I don't even know if they wanted to go to Winston because remember, they were kind of trying to look at DTR first as like the primary backup, and then he got hurt, and then Winston is now in. So it doesn't look like the Browns even necessarily wanted to go to Winston, and he's there out of necessity. So I think in 2025, they move away from Winston, not sure what they go to, if it's another veteran, if they draft a rookie, whatever it is. But I think that without Jameis Winston, Jerry Jeudy is going to come crashing back down to earth. So I think he's a sell right now. If you can sell off of this production, I looked at his wide receiver value on Cape Trade Cut. He's in the 40s still, which is actually, I think, pretty modest and pretty low for Jerry Jeudy. I would be buying at those prices. But I think that if you're in a league, especially a contender that really looks at Jerry Jeudy as like a wide receiver 2 or even wide receiver 1 moving forward, and you can get Jalen Waddle or Brandon Ayuk or Tank Dell or, any one of those kind of wide receivers for Jerry Jeudy right now, I think I would be doing that in a heartbeat. So, or if you can get a first for Jerry Jeudy right now, I would be doing that in a heartbeat. So I think those are the ways that I would want to sell Jerry Jeudy, not just to say sell him just because his value is too high. I don't think this is a Chase Brown situation. I don't think the community has caught up to Jerry Jeudy's production in terms of value just because this is his 5th year. We've seen him before. We know that his value is inflated because of Winston, but so I think the large majority of the community understands that, and that's what's leading to his kind of wide receiver 40-ish KTC value. But in certain leagues out there, I think that there can definitely be leagues where he is being sold as more of a wide receiver 1 or even a high wide receiver 2, and I would sell on those values. All right, back to the running back position now. Alvin Kamara has been probably the most underrated running back in fantasy football in 2024, if not honestly even longer. I feel like he's been, at least from a redraft circle and in and around August, when I've been kind of keeping in tune with what goes on and get the redraft itch every year. Kamara seems like that one running back. It's basically been like 3 years in a row now where he's fallen in redraft circles just because I think we're tired of him. It's kind of like what happened with Ezekiel Elliott before he ultimately really fell off a cliff. But I think we just have exhaustion with Alvin Kamara, and he's just been too good for too long. And we want it to, not that we want it to end, but it just feels like it should be coming to an end at some point, and it's not. He's the RB3 overall right now in fantasy football, 19.5 fantasy points per game. That's the exact same points per game as Derrick Henry. It's better than a lot of other running backs not named Saquon Barkley right now. He was the RB3 in points per game last year in 2023. He was a top 15 running back in total points, but he missed the first 4 or 5 weeks. So RB3 in points per game when he was actually playing. Top 15 running back in 2022, top 6 running back in 2021. Like it just keeps happening for Alvin Kamara. And I don't know what's necessarily going to happen to change that. He's not slowing down. They signed him to an extension this year, and this team is kind of salary cap stuck around him. I think they're stuck with Derek Carr based on the salary, the contract that they gave him, and then they kind of reworked in the offseason. They're kind of stuck paying Taysom Hill, and now Taysom Hill is recovering from knee surgery. Chris Olave is just Chris Olave, and now he has health concerns with multiple concussions this year and hasn't been playing for the past few weeks. Rashid Shaheed also recovering from knee surgery. And just everything flows back to Alvin Kamara being the engine for this offense. And I don't know how that changes over the next 1 to 2 years. Like, I look at his value on KTC, RB 19 overall and keep trade cut. And I just don't know how that's not a buy. I don't know how he doesn't continue producing at this high end level like Derrick Henry, who is the RB 12 at 31 years old. Kamara is 2 years younger than that. I think that he's a buy at RB 19. Like, Tyrone Tracy is right behind him. I'd rather have Alvin Kamara than Tyrone Tracy for the next year or two. Chuba Hubbard right behind Tyrone Tracy. I'd rather have Kamara. DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris, James Conner, J.K. Dobbins. I would use any one of those running backs and move over to Alvin Kamara. And I think that Kamara is going to have a better fantasy season this year, for the rest of the year, next year, and potentially even in 2026, like Derrick Henry's doing right now at 31, because there's just no sign that Kamara is going to stop. So why would you not invest into Alvin Kamara at basically RB 20 prices instead of Derrick Henry at RB 12 prices? So I think Kamara is a really good buy right now, and I think he will be a good buy in the offseason as well. And if you're looking to buy players, especially running backs like Kamara, you probably want to be buying them in the offseason anyway, because that's going to be the time that they're the most devalued, especially as we get rookie fever and all that kind of stuff. This might be better advice to take into the offseason and see if you can buy Kamara for cheaper in a month or two than you do right now. But I'm putting my stamp of confidence, unless something were to happen over the next couple of weeks. I'm putting my stamp of confidence on Alvin Kamara as a longer term asset than I think a lot of people want to give him credit for, especially compared to a lot of other running backs who are younger. Kamara, I think, might just be better and be better longer. All right, this is the final slide on this one. We have to talk about Christian McCaffrey now because of what happened on, what was that, Sunday night with the injury, another knee injury popping up. I don't have any stats on here just because we know it's Christian McCaffrey. We know the story. He's elite. He dealt with injuries this year, coming into the year with his Achilles tendonitis. Now he's out again with a knee injury. The good news, at least, is that this knee injury does not appear to be super serious. Like, it's not like he tore an Achilles. He didn't tear his ACL or PCL or LCL or any of the other CLs. It just seems like it's more of like a sprain. It's a PCL injury that is not going to require surgery. And I'm hoping that this is very similar to the injury that Puka Nacua had at the beginning of the year. Puka sprained his PCL in week 1 or week 2, then was out essentially until like week 8 or 9, and then has come back and been fantastic because he's Puka Nacua. I'm hopeful that Christian McCaffrey's situation is kind of similar, and maybe he even benefits from the fact that the Niners are not going to make the playoffs, so this injury is going to take him into the offseason. He can use all offseason to get healthy, to get strong, to go through all of that kind of work. And hopefully when we get to the actual 2025 season, that he is ready to go. And we're talking about him again as another, top 5, 6, 7 fantasy running back for redraft. And that might bump up his value for Dynasty, or at least once we see him actually play and he ramps off a couple big runs, and he has that 120-point game where he doesn't even score a touchdown. He has that 30-point game when he does score a touchdown, or he breaks it a 70-yard run, and he looks like Christian McCaffrey again. That's the point, is that hopefully he looks like CMC again in September, and that raises his value. So I'm looking to buy CMC right now if you can, especially if the person that had CMC was a contender. They were happy that they got him back, and then they just lost him again. So to hopefully reclaim their championship hopes, I want to see if you can still trade still, which hopefully you still can. But if you can still trade and CMC is on a contender, I want to see how I can pull him away for the absolute cheapest that I can by dangling another productive running back right in front of that manager's face. How can I turn Tyrone Tracy into Christian McCaffrey? How can I turn Chuba Hubbard into Christian McCaffrey? Najee Harris, James Conner, any of these other kind of running backs that maybe it's Isaiah Pacheco or Brian Robinson, somebody like that you can dangle in front of the CMC manager and say, hey, I'll give you this production now for Christian McCaffrey. And I feel like a good majority of those contenders will say yes, because they might be done with CMC. Maybe they've dealt with injuries before with him and they're just kind of done with him. They might just go straight for the points. They might be worried about CMC's long-term health, considering the fact that he's 28, going to be 29 next offseason, coming off of basically 2 injuries this year. They might be concerned about his long-term value, especially if you give him a player that's, 4 or 5 years younger than CMC. That might be a benefit. But I want CMC in those deals because I think, like I just said, his value might rise artificially because we're talking about CMC being back to being CMC throughout the course of the summer into the offseason. And then hopefully in 2025, in the actual season, he's producing well, like Alvin Kamara is now, like, Derrick Henry is now, like Saquon Barkley is right now. Values are rising because of production, and then you can sell for a profit next year or use him to win a championship next year. There's always that too. So I'd be looking to buy CMC if you still can. He might be a good buy in January too, once trading is open back up for those of you who can't trade right now after the season is over. He might be a good buy in January, but I feel like in the offseason, as the offseason goes on, it's probably going to be harder to buy CMC because the closer we get to the season, the closer we get to CMC being CMC again. But if you can still trade, try to buy Christian McCaffrey. But that is going to be it. Hopefully you guys like this kind of different style of Dynasty lessons learned. Instead of going game by game, especially at this point in the season, I kind of go by some big players that I want to either buy or sell or just talk about because of news happening, trends that we're seeing, all that kind of stuff. So I think this is going to be the new format moving forward for the rest of the year over the last month. And then, of course, we'll be doing way more content. Justin's now back from his honeymoon. So we're looking on content already for 2025. Rookie season is going to be here. Off-season buys and sells, all that fantastic stuff as we move to the 2025 season. But we got to get you guys 2024 Dynasty Championship. So appreciate you guys watching and sticking around. And I will catch a lot of you on Friday afternoon for the Friday AMA at 12 p.m. Eastern time. But until then, we'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.